The challenge that changed Kung Fu forever. The air in the training yard of Hong Kong's Chinatown gym was thick with tension. Bruce Lee, then 31 years old, adjusted his wrist straps as he watched the young fighter who had just entered the room. Jet Li, just 19 years old, was a promise of traditional wushu, known for his speed and precision in choreographed competition movements. But there, under the watchful eyes of masters and students, there was no room for choreography. The rumors had reached Bruce's ears days before. It was said that the boy, a national wushu champion, had questioned the effectiveness of Jeet Kune Do in an interview. Jeet Kune Do is fast, but will it work against a fighter trained in classic wushu, Jet had said, not knowing that his words would echo as a direct challenge to the creator of the style. Bruce was not a man to ignore provocations. When Jet entered the gym that afternoon, accompanied by his trainer, silence ensued. The students stopped their training, the conversation stopped. Bruce wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and walked to the center of the mat, his eyes fixed on the young man. "I heard that you have doubts about what I teach," said Bruce, his voice calm, but filled with an energy that made the air vibrate. "If you want to know if it works, come." Jet hesitated for a second. It wasn't just any challenge, it was Bruce Lee, the man who had revolutionized martial arts, who had faced traditional kung fu masters and street fighters with equal ease. But he didn't back down. He advanced, assuming a classic wushu stance, his fists closed in high guard. Bruce didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, as if inviting the boy to attack. The first blow came quickly, a spinning, precise kick, calculated to unbalance him. Bruce dodged it with minimal body movement, as if the kick hadn't even existed. Before Jet could recover, Bruce counterattacked. A direct, short punch exploded in the young man's solar plexus. The impact was dry, and Jet staggered back, his lungs burning. "First," Bruce said, motionless. Jet took a deep breath and advanced again, this time with a sequence of punches in a straight line, combining speed and technique. Bruce blocked the first with his forearm, dodged the second with a hip turn and, in the third, counterattacked with a palm strike that hit Jet's chin. The young man felt his teeth chatter, the world spin for an instant. When he regained focus, Bruce was still there, still, as if he hadn't moved. Second. The third attack was different. Jet knew he couldn't repeat the same mistakes. He stepped back, faked a low kick and, when Bruce prepared to block, he turned his body and threw a side kick towards the ribs. It was a perfect blow, full of strength and technique. But Bruce wasn't there anymore. At the last moment, he moved to the side, grabbed Jet's leg mid-air, and, in one fluid movement, twisted it slightly, knocking him off balance. Before the young man could react, the third punch came, a straight right that stopped inches from Jet's nose. The sound of the wind cut by the fist echoed in the hall. "Third," Bruce murmured, letting go of the boy's leg. Jet fell to his knees, not from the pain, but from the realization. He had trained his entire life to be the best at traditional wushu, to execute perfect, choreographed, beautiful movements. But there, in front of Bruce Lee, he realized that beauty meant nothing without effectiveness. Jeet Kune Do was not about forms, it was about adaptation, instinct, destroying the opponent with minimal movement. Bruce reached out and helped Jet to his feet. "You're fast," he said. "But speed without purpose is just dancing." Jet hung his head, embarrassed but also fascinated. At that moment, something inside him changed. He didn't abandon wushu, but he understood that he needed to evolve. Years later, when he became a martial arts legend in cinema, Jet Li would say that that day was the most important day of his life. Not because he had been defeated, but because he had seen, for the first time, the future of Kung Fu. And the future had a name, Bruce Lee. The Dragon Awakens. The following months were of transformation. Jet Li returned to training with a new obsession, no longer with the perfection of his forms, but with the brutal efficiency that Bruce Lee had shown him. His wushu masters, however, did not understand that change. For them, martial arts were a sacred dance, an ancient heritage that could not be corrupted by the simplicity of Jeet Kune Do. "You are missing the essence," shouted Master Wu, his former instructor, when Jet refused to perform a traditional sequence at a national tournament. "Kung Fu is not just fighting, it is culture." Jet didn't respond. I knew words wouldn't convince. Instead, he took to the mat and, in front of an astonished audience, delivered a series of direct blows, without any flourishes, that knocked his opponent down in seconds. The audience erupted in murmurs. Some applauded, others were outraged. "That's not Kung Fu," someone shouted. "That's what works," Jet replied coldly. The rupture was inevitable. Jet was kicked out of the national wushu team, labeled a traitor to traditions. But he didn't care. I knew I was on the right path. The price of evolution. Without official support, Jet plunged into solitary training. He studied boxing, judo, fencing, any art that could complement what he had learned from Bruce. He turned his body into a weapon, every muscle tuned for explosion, every movement calculated for maximum impact. But loneliness took its toll. Without competitions, without recognition, he began to doubt. It was then that he received a letter. "Your talent cannot be wasted. Come to Hong Kong. Cinema needs you." It was signed by Raymond Chow, producer of Golden Harvest. The legend on screen. Hong Kong was a different world. Martial arts cinema was on the rise, but films still followed old formulas, elaborate choreography, invincible heroes, caricatured villains. Jet saw an opportunity there. "I want to do something real," I told Chow in their first meeting. "No wires, no tricks. Just fight." Chow hesitated. The public wanted spectacle, not reality. But Jet insisted. And when Shaolin Temple, 1982, debuted, the world saw something unprecedented, a fighter who not only performed strikes, but executed them with frightening precision. He was no longer the wushu prodigy. He was a warrior. The following films consolidated his legend. Once Upon a Time in China made him an icon, but it also brought him into conflict with martial arts purists, who accused him of Americanizing Kung Fu. Jet ignored the criticism. He knew he wasn't betraying his art, he was carrying it forward, just as Bruce Lee had done. The Last Duel. Years later, already established, Jet received an unexpected invitation, a challenge from a Tai Chi master, a man who claimed that true strength came from gentleness, not aggression. "You fight with anger," said the master, an old man with serene eyes. "I struggle with emptiness." Jet accepted. Not out of pride, but out of curiosity. I wanted to test how far I had come. The duel took place in a silent courtyard, in front of few spectators. The master didn't move. He just breathed, his hands hovering like leaves in the wind. Jet attacked first, a quick, precise kick. The master dodged with an almost imperceptible movement, and Jet felt an invisible force push him back. Tried again. And again. Each blow was absorbed, redirected, as if the air itself repelled it. Within minutes, I was exhausted. The master didn't even sweat. "You are strong," said the old man. "But uncontrolled force is just noise." Jet fell to his knees, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. He had spent his life seeking perfection in movement, but he had never understood the silence between them. The legacy. Jet Li never abandoned Jeet Kune Do. But, from that day on, he incorporated something new into his training, stillness. His subsequent films reflected this change. Less explosions, more fluidity. Less anger, more wisdom. In an interview, years later, he was asked what the most important moment of his career had been. "It wasn't when I won a tournament," he replied. "Not even when I became a star. That's when Bruce Lee knocked me to the ground. And that's when a Tai Chi master showed me that sometimes the greatest strength lies in not fighting." And so, the boy who one day dreamed of being the best in the world at wushu became something greater, a man who understood that martial arts were not about winning, but about evolving. The dragon had awakened. And now, it flew. The last dragon. The years passed, and Jet Li, now with gray hair and slower but no less precise movements, found himself facing a new challenge, not on screen but in real life. A cancer had settled in his body, silent like an enemy waiting for the right moment to attack. The news came like a punch he didn't see coming, but this time, there was no camera, there was no choreography, there was no audience to applaud his resistance. He remembered Bruce Lee's words, "Don't pray for an easy life, pray for the strength to endure a difficult one." And then, like old times, he took a deep breath and accepted the fight. The treatments were long, painful, a battle where the opponent had no face, just a cold name, disease. But Jet didn't fight like in the movies. There were no war cries, no punches in the air. He fought with the same stillness he had learned from the Tai Chi master, letting the medicine do its work while he, inside, grew stronger. He meditated between chemotherapy sessions, moved slowly when his body allowed it, and, above all, he didn't allow himself to hate the process. One day, as he walked slowly through the gardens of his home in Singapore, his grandson, an 8-year-old boy named Kai, ran up to him. "Grandpa, are you going to die?" he asked, his eyes wide, his voice trembling. Jet carefully crouched down, propping himself up on his good knee. He held the boy's face between his hands, feeling the soft skin, the life pulsing there. "We all will, one day," he said, smiling. "But I'm not going now. I still have things to teach you." "How to fight?" Kai asked, excited. "No. How to live." And then, for the first time in years, Jet allowed himself to truly teach. Not on a film set, not in a dojo full of students, but there, in the backyard, under the shade of a leafy tree. He showed Kai how to breathe, how to feel the ground beneath his feet, how to let anger pass without hurting anyone. These were not lessons of fighting, but of peace. "Martial arts is not about defeating others," he said, as Kai tried to imitate his slow movements. "They're about not being defeated by yourself." The boy didn't understand everything, but he felt it. And that was enough. Over time, the cancer receded. It was not an epic victory, like in the movies, but a silent truce, an agreement between the body and the will. Jet returned to training, but now with a different awareness. His movements were smoother, almost as if he were dancing with the wind. He still filmed, but he chose roles that reflected this new phase: wise men, serene masters, figures who carried the weight of experience without losing their lightness. In his last major film, he played an old master who, at the climax of the story, faced a much younger and stronger enemy. But instead of fighting, he would just stop. And in the silence that followed, the opponent, confused, let his guard down. It was at that moment that the master smiled and said, "The true art is not in winning. It's about making the other person realize that there is nothing to win." The audience applauded, excited. But Jet, behind the scenes, knew it wasn't just a script. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way. Years later, already in his 70s, Jet Li said goodbye to the screen. Not with an action film, but with a documentary about his life, where he spoke openly about his battles, against fame, against illness, against the illusion that physical strength was everything. In the end, he was sitting on a park bench, looking at the horizon. "I used to think it was a dragon," he said, smiling. "But now I know I'm just a man. And it's okay." The camera moved back, showing him from behind, small in the face of the vastness of the sky. He raised his hand in a simple gesture, as if waving to someone who wasn't there. And then, the screen went black. The dragon had not died. He had just learned to fly without wings. The last act. 5 years later, the world still remembered Jet Li as the man who transformed the martial art into poetry. But, for those who knew him closely, he was no longer the icon with sharp eyes and precise strikes. It was just Li Lianjia, the name his parents gave him, the boy who sold ice cream on the streets of Beijing before he was discovered. Now, at 75, he lived in Singapore, far from the spotlight, in a simple house with a garden that he cultivated with his own hands. Ankylosing spondylitis, the disease that had haunted him for decades, had robbed him of his mobility. Doctors told him he would never walk again without pain, but he refused a wheelchair. "I still have legs," he said, leaning on a bamboo cane that an old friend had given him. He walked slowly, as if each step were a meditation. Sometimes he stopped in the middle of the garden and closed his eyes, feeling the wind touch his face. It was in these moments that he most resembled the dragon of old, not in strength, but in stillness. His youngest daughter, Jane, lived with him. She had inherited his discipline, but not his passion for martial arts. She was a doctor, specializing in rehabilitation, and spent her nights adjusting her father's exercises, trying to alleviate the stiffness in his joints. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," she said, while massaging his shoulders. He smiled, but didn't respond. I knew she didn't understand. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about not surrendering. One day, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, a handwritten letter and an invitation. The Beijing Film Festival wanted to honor him with a retrospective of his career. "Your presence would be an honor," said the text, signed by a young director who had grown up watching his films. Jet Li read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his desk drawer. I didn't say anything to Jane. That night, he dreamed of the past. He dreamed of the Shaolin Temple, of the endless training under the scorching sun, of the master who had told him, "True strength is not in the punch, but in the ability to withstand pain without breaking." He woke up sweating, his body was stiff, his breathing was shallow. He looked at the ceiling, waiting for the pain to go away. When he finally got up, he went to the desk and picked up the letter. He wrote a response on the back. "Thank you. But the dragon has already flown." The festival took place without him. On the auditorium's giant screen, they projected scenes from their most famous films, Once Upon a Time in China, Fist of Legend, Hero, while the audience gave a standing ovation. The young director who had invited him took the stage and spoke about legacy, about how Jet Li had redefined what it meant to be a hero. "He taught us that the real fight is not against others, but against ourselves," he said, emotionally. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Jet Li was sitting in his garden, looking at the flowers that Jane had planted. The afternoon sun beat down on his face, and he closed his eyes, letting the heat sink into his bones. He thought of all the roles he had played, the monk, the warrior, the common man fighting fate. He thought about how many times he had confused fiction with reality, how many times he had believed he was invincible. The cane was resting at his side. He took it and stood up, slowly, as always. He walked to the gate of the house and looked at the street. There were no cameras, there were no crowds. Just the silence and the wind. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He took a deep breath and performed a slow, almost imperceptible taolu, the sequence of movements he had learned at the age of 8, when he still believed that kung fu could save him from everything. His arms moved in the air, fragile but precise. His legs trembled but did not give way. When he finished, he was panting, sweat running down his forehead. But smile. Jane found him like this, standing in the middle of the garden, as if he had just won an invisible battle. "What was that?" she asked, worried. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at his own hands, wrinkled, marked by time. "Goodbye," he said at last. "For the man I thought I was." The following years were silent. Jet Li devoted himself to writing, not screenplays, but memoirs. He wrote about his poor childhood, about the pressure of being an idol, about the pain that followed him like a shadow. It was not a book to be published. It was for him to understand. One spring morning, Jane found him sitting at the kitchen table, pen still in hand, eyes closed. She thought he was sleeping. But when he got closer, he saw that he was no longer breathing. The doctor said it was quick and painless. Like he decided it was time, he murmured respectfully. At the funeral, there were no grandiose speeches. Just some friends, his family, and a silent screening of his older films. Jane placed a copy of Shaolin Temple in the coffin, along with the bamboo cane. "So you can walk without pain," he whispered. Later, when everyone had left, she returned home and found her father's manuscript on the table. On the first page, one sentence. "I wasn't a dragon. I was just a man who learned to fly through his own scars." She read to the end, crying silently. And then, for the first time, he understood. The dragon had never needed wings. He had always known that true flight was made up of falls, of getting up, of accepting that strength is not in the body, but in the courage to continue. And so, Jet Li left, not as a legend, but as a man who had, in the end, found peace.